It started as a quiet Thursday night in a small town outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was alone in my one-bedroom apartment, catching up on work emails and sipping coffee. My boyfriend Jason was out of town for the week, and with no pressing plans, I decided to enjoy the solitude. Around 8:30 p.m., my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." A pause. Then, a man's voice, calm and measured. "Hey, is this Emma?" I frowned. "No, you've got the wrong number." "Oh, sorry about that," he said. "You sound nice, though. What's your name?" I hung up immediately, feeling unsettled. Wrong numbers happened, but something about the way he spoke felt off. Too intentional. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. The same number. I ignored it, but the calls kept coming, one after another. By the fifth call, I silenced my phone and tried to focus on my work. 10 minutes later, my landline rang. Almost no one had that number except close friends and family. I picked up, my stomach twisting. "Hello? It's rude to hang up on someone you know," the same voice said, now sharper, more assertive. "I just want to talk to you." My hands trembled as I slammed the phone down. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, trying to calm my breathing. The landline rang again, but I didn't answer. The caller left a voicemail instead. "I know you're there," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You can't ignore me forever." I called Jason, hoping for reassurance. "It's probably some random creep," he said, trying to calm me down. "Just block the number and stay inside." I wanted to believe him, but something about the persistence of the calls made my skin crawl. By 9:30 p.m., the calls had stopped, and I started to relax. I made myself a sandwich, turned on the TV, and tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it made my blood run cold. The front door of my apartment was visible from the living room, and I could see the shadow of someone standing on the other side. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The shadow shifted slightly. Then came another knock, louder this time. "I'm calling the police," I shouted. A low chuckle came from the other side of the door. "You should have answered my calls," the voice said. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone with trembling hands and dialing 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line as I locked myself in the bathroom. My heart pounded as I listened for any sound, every second stretching into an eternity. The knocks turned into banging, the door shaking under the force. "Let me in, Emma," the man shouted. "I know you're in there." "I've already called the police," I screamed back, trying to sound braver than I felt. The banging stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. Then, faintly, the sound of heavy boots retreating down the hallway. When the police arrived, they found no sign of him. However, they discovered something that sent chills down my spine. A small piece of paper wedged into the doorframe, with my name written on it. The officers said the man likely had been watching me for some time, possibly even following me home. I changed my number, added extra locks to the door, and moved out of the apartment within a month. To this day, I keep a baseball bat by my bed and answer unknown calls with caution, because you never know who's on the other end, or how far they are willing to go. Growing up, my parents always warned me to double-check locks when I was home alone. Our house, tucked into a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago, had a few quirks. A squeaky staircase, a drafty attic, and a basement door that never quite closed properly unless you gave it a good shove. That door was the first thing I checked when my parents left for an anniversary dinner one snowy evening in December. I was 17 and more annoyed than nervous about being left alone, especially since the storm outside made the house creak and groan more than usual. I double-checked all the locks, including the one on the basement door, and settled in the living room with a blanket and a book. It was around 8 p.m. when I first heard it, the faint sound of movement coming from the basement. I froze, listening intently. It was subtle, like the shuffle of feet across the concrete floor. At first, I told myself it was just the storm. The old house made all kinds of noises when the wind was strong. But then I heard it again, this time louder, distinct, deliberate footsteps. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up quickly, but his calm response irritated me. "It's probably just the furnace or something shifting down there," he said. "If you're really worried, call the police." I hung up, still clutching the phone. The logical part of my brain told me he was right, but something about the sound didn't sit well with me. I decided to peek down the basement stairs, just to prove to myself that nothing was there. Grabbing a flashlight, I slowly opened the door and shined the beam down the steps. The light illuminated the concrete floor, the old washing machine, and the shelves of storage boxes. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavier somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, just as I was about to shut the door, I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, partially obscured by shadows, was a pair of muddy footprints leading from the back of the basement toward the stairs. My chest tightened as I realized they hadn't been there before. Panicking, I slammed the basement doors shut and locked it. My hands shook as I dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about what I'd seen. She told me to stay put, lock myself in a room, and wait for the officers to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as I listened for any sound from the basement. Then, just as the dispatcher said the officers were pulling into the driveway, I heard it. The doorknob to the basement door rattling. I screamed, yelling that the police were here. The rattling stopped, followed by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the basement. The officers arrived moments later. They searched the basement and found the back window broken. It seemed whoever was down there had slipped in during the storm and planned to stay hidden until I went to sleep. The officers also found a crowbar and a small backpack stuffed with zip ties and duct tape near the shelves. Whoever the intruder was, they'd been waiting for the right moment to act. That night, my parents replaced the flimsy basement door with a solid steel one and installed security cameras around the house. Even now, years later, I can't go near a basement without hearing those footsteps and remembering how close I came to something I don't even want to imagine. I wasn't supposed to be home that weekend. My roommate Kelly and I had planned a trip to her parents' lake house, but she came down with the flu at the last minute. So there I was, spending Friday night alone in our small rental house on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where you could hear the hum of streetlights and the occasional bark of a distant dog. By 10 p.m., I'd settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, half watching some true crime documentary while scrolling through my phone. The night felt uneventful until I heard the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant. I paused, my heart picking up just a little. Our neighborhood wasn't exactly bustling, and unexpected visitors at that hour were rare. I muted the TV and sat there, waiting to see if it would happen again. A moment passed, then another knock. This one was louder. I tiptoed to the door and peeked through the peephole. A man stood there, wearing a dark hoodie pulled tight around his face. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he shifted slightly from foot to foot. "Who is it?" I called out, keeping my voice steady. He didn't answer at first. Then, after a moment, he muttered, "I'm looking for a friend. Does Kyle live here?" Kyle? There was no Kyle in our house, and I didn't know anyone by that name. Something about his tone felt off, like he wasn't confused, but testing me. "No, you've got the wrong house," I said, my voice firm. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned closer to the door. "Are you sure? I thought this was his place." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Why wasn't he walking away?" I repeated, louder this time. "There's no Kyle here. Please leave." Silence. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, then slowly turned and walked down the steps. I exhaled a shaky breath and double-checked the deadbolt. For a moment, I thought it was over. 15 minutes passed. I just started to relax when I heard something that made my stomach drop. A soft scraping noise coming from the back of the house. The kitchen window. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator about what was happening. While I stayed on the line, I crept toward the kitchen, careful not to make any noise. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate. Peeking around the corner, I saw the silhouette of the man trying to jimmy the lock on the window. My heart raced as the operator reassured me that officers were on the way. I told her I was moving to my bedroom and locking the door. Once inside, I shoved my dresser against the door and grabbed a heavy lamp as a makeshift weapon. The scraping stopped, then came a loud thud, followed by another. He was trying to force the window open. Minutes passed like hours, and then I heard the sweetest sound in the world: police sirens. The thudding stopped, and I heard hurried footsteps retreating into the night. The officers arrived within moments. They searched the property and found the man hiding behind a neighbor's shed. He had a knife in his pocket and a backpack full of duct tape, zip ties, and gloves. The officer told me later that he didn't believe the man was looking for any Kyle. That night, I realized how quickly a mundane evening could turn into a nightmare. Since then, I never spend a night at home without double-checking every lock, and I never answer the door without a reason. It was a cold January evening in Minneapolis, and I was home alone for the first time in months. My roommate, Angela, had gone to visit her family for the weekend, leaving me in our small apartment. I relished the quiet and decided to spend the evening catching up on some reading. The apartment was on the third floor of an older building, with creaky wooden floors and a few windows that never quite sealed properly. The wind whistled faintly outside, and I had just curled up on the couch with a blanket when I heard the first knock. It was faint and hesitant, like someone testing to see if I'd notice. I froze, looking toward the front door. Angela and I weren't exactly social butterflies, and we never had visitors who didn't call first. When the knock came again, louder this time, I stood up cautiously and walked to the door. My heart raced as I peered through the peephole. A man stood there, dressed in a dark coat, his face partially hidden by a knit hat. He wasn't moving, just standing, stiffly, with his hands shoved into his pockets. "Yes," I called out, keeping my voice firm. "Delivery," he said flatly. I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything, and neither had Angela. Besides, he wasn't holding a package. "You have the wrong apartment," I replied. The man didn't move. "Are you sure?" His voice was slow and deliberate, as if he didn't believe me. "Yes," I snapped, trying to sound confident. "Go away." I watched as he finally turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing from view. I waited a few moments before locking the chain on the door and heading back to the couch, my nerves buzzing. An hour passed, and I'd almost convinced myself it was just a mix-up when I heard something that sent chills down my spine. A faint, rattling noise. It was coming from the kitchen window. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, but the fire escape ran up the side of the building, leading directly to the window. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, careful to stay out of view. I peeked around the corner. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The man from the hallway was on the fire escape, crouched by the window, fiddling with the lock. I quickly called 911, whispering to the operator about what was happening. She told me to stay quiet and get to a safe spot. I crept back to the living room, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Minutes later, I heard the window slide open. I panicked and darted into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hand shook as I moved my dresser against the door, creating a makeshift barricade. I could hear heavy footsteps moving through the apartment, each one deliberate and slow. The operator assured me that the officers were on the way and that they couldn't come fast enough. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. "Hello?" The man's voice was calm, almost casual. "I just want to talk." I stayed silent, pressing myself against the far wall. The door handle jiggled once, then twice. He didn't try to force it, but stood there, waiting. I heard the faint crackle of police radios outside, followed by a loud knock on the front door. "Minneapolis Police Department, open up." The man didn't hesitate. His footsteps pounded toward the window, and I heard the screech of the fire escape as he climbed down. When the police entered, they searched the building but couldn't find him. However, they did find a knife tucked into the cushions of the couch and a length of rope in the hallway closet. The officers believed he'd been watching the building and might have entered earlier in the day, hiding somewhere until he decided to make his move. The apartment didn't feel the same after that night. Angela and I moved out a month later, and to this day I never stay in a place with easy access to the windows. It was my first night staying in my aunt's house alone. She'd gone on a 2-week vacation and asked me to house sit for her. The arrangement seemed perfect. I'd get a peaceful space to myself, and she'd get someone to keep an eye on her place in a quiet neighborhood in Portland. The house was cozy but old, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. By 9 p.m., the rain had started, a steady drizzle tapping against the windows. I locked the front and back doors, checked the windows, and settled in the living room with a cup of tea. The first odd thing happened around 10:30 p.m. I heard a faint shuffle coming from the backyard. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or a stray animal, but then it happened again. A deliberate, muffled step, followed by a light tapping noise, like fingers drumming on glass. My heart skipped as I froze, listening intently. The sound was coming from the back door. Slowly, I crept toward it, trying to keep my footsteps silent. The house had a small backyard enclosed by a tall wooden fence, so the idea of someone being back there didn't sit right with me. I peeked through the small window by the door. At first, I didn't see anything, just the rain glistening on the patio. Then I noticed it. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the porch light, motionless. The rain blurred their shape, but I could make out a hood pulled low over their face. I stepped back, heart pounding. Who would be in my aunt's backyard at this hour? I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it through the window to make it obvious someone was inside. The figure didn't move. They stood there, eerily still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "This is private property. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Nothing. No movement, no response. I didn't wait for a reaction. I locked the deadbolt and called 911. As I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on the backyard, but the figure was gone. The police told me to stay inside and wait for them to arrive. A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps inside the house. I froze. The noise came from upstairs, a deliberate and heavy thud, like boots on the old wooden floors. My mind raced. Had the person out back already gotten inside? I hadn't heard any glass break or doors open, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. I whispered to the dispatcher, explaining what I was hearing, and she told me to lock myself in a room and stay on the line. My hands trembled as I crept into the small downstairs bathroom, locking the door behind me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, he was coming down the stairs. "Police are 2 minutes away," the dispatcher assured me. I held my breath as the footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. I could see the shadow of feet under the gap. My heart pounded so hard, I thought whoever was outside could hear it. Then the door handle rattled, slowly at first, then more aggressively. I pressed myself against the farthest wall, clutching a heavy ceramic vase as my only defense. Suddenly I heard a loud bang, someone shouting outside. The sound of sirens blared through the rain, and the person outside the bathroom door ran. The police found him hiding in the crawl space beneath the house. It turned out he'd been inside the attic when I arrived that evening, likely having entered through an unlocked window earlier in the day. The figure I saw in the backyard? A decoy he'd set up. A raincoat stuffed with clothes propped on a stick. The officer said he'd been watching the house for days, waiting for my aunt to leave. They found a knife and duct tape among his things. I'll never forget the feeling of knowing someone was inside that house with me, silently waiting, biding their time.